The small diner buzzed with the usual lunchtime crowd. Workers on break, families sharing meals, and a few travelers passing through. Among them was Sergeant James Carter, a decorated soldier who had just returned from deployment. Dressed in his uniform, he walked in, hoping for a quiet meal. But what should have been a simple lunch quickly turned into an incident that no one in the diner would forget. A young waitress eyed him with a look of disdain. Her voice, sharp and cold, cut through the hum of conversation. "We don't serve people like you here," she sneered, motioning toward the door. Gasps rippled through the restaurant as silence fell over the patrons. James stood still, his jaw tightening, but before he could respond, fate took an unexpected turn, one that would leave the entire diner stunned. For a moment, James Carter didn't move. He had faced hostility before, on the battlefield, in the streets, even in the very country he had sworn to protect. But no matter how many times it happened, the sting never faded. The waitress, arms crossed, tapped her foot impatiently. "You heard me," she said, her voice laced with irritation. A hush had fallen over the diner, all eyes now locked onto the unfolding scene. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others whispered among themselves, but no one spoke up. James exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the strap of his duffel bag. He had spent years fighting for freedom, yet here he was, treated like he didn't belong. But instead of anger, he felt something else. Resolve. "I served this country," he said calmly, his voice steady but firm. "I risked my life so people, all people, could enjoy their rights, including the right to sit in a diner and have a meal." The waitress rolled her eyes. "I don't care who you are. You need to leave." Then, a voice cut through the silence. "That's enough." The owner of the diner, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, had emerged from behind the counter. His gaze was heavy with disappointment as he looked at the waitress. "Get your things and go. You're fired." Her face paled. "What? But I won't have that kind of hatred in my establishment," the owner said firmly. "Now get out." She stammered, looking around for support, but found none. The other employees avoided her gaze. A few customers shook their heads. Humiliated, she grabbed her purse and stormed out. James, still standing by the entrance, watched the scene unfold. The owner turned to him and gestured toward an open table. "Please, sir, stay. Your meal is on the house." James hesitated. He wasn't used to kindness following discrimination so quickly. But then, a young girl sitting with her parents, no older than 10, offered him a small smile. "Thank you for your service," she said softly. Something in his chest loosened. He nodded at her, then at the owner, and made his way to the table. As he sat down, a waitress, a different one, approached with a warm smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone gentle. For the first time in a long while, James felt something unexpected, hope. As James sat down, the tension in the diner slowly began to dissolve. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the clinking of silverware against plates filled the air again. But something had changed. People stole glances at him, some with guilt, others with admiration. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, set a glass of water in front of him. "Take your time, honey," she said, as if sensing the weight he carried. "You deserve better than what just happened." James gave her a small nod, appreciating her kindness but unsure of what to say. He wasn't looking for pity, just a quiet meal, a moment to breathe. Across the room, the young girl who had thanked him whispered something to her mother. The woman smiled and nodded before waving down the waitress. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with a slice of warm apple pie and placed it in front of James. "It's from the little one over there," she said, tilting her head toward the girl. "She thought you might like it." James looked over, and the girl grinned shyly before giving him a small salute, mimicking what she had likely seen soldiers do in movies. For the first time that day, James smiled. He picked up his fork and took a bite of the pie. Tasted like something he hadn't had in a long time, home. But just as he was beginning to settle in, the door to the diner swung open with force. A man in a trucker's cap and a heavy jacket stepped inside, looking around with sharp eyes. He was big, with broad shoulders and hands rough from hard labor. When his gaze landed on James, something flickered in his expression. James immediately braced himself. The man walked forward, his boots thudding against the floor. For a brief moment, the diner fell silent again. The tension returned. Then the man did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded, worn photograph. He placed it on the table in front of James. "I served too," the man said, his voice rough with age. "Vietnam. Lost my best friend out there. He looked a lot like you." James looked down at the photo. Two young soldiers, side by side, smiling in a jungle somewhere far away. The man took a breath, as if steadying himself. "When I came home, he didn't. And I saw too many people treat him like he wasn't one of us. I didn't say enough back then. But I'm saying it now." He extended a calloused hand. "Welcome home, soldier." James stared at the outstretched hand for a moment before gripping it firmly. "Welcome home," James repeated, his voice quiet but full of meaning. In that moment, the past and present seemed to blur. Two men, two soldiers, separated by time but bound by the same struggles, the same sacrifices. The man gave James a firm nod before turning to the counter. "Put his meal on my tab," he told the owner. James opened his mouth to protest, but the man simply shook his head. "This one's on all the brothers who never made it back." James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had come in expecting nothing more than a meal. Instead, he had found something else, reminders of the worst of humanity, but also the best. Maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't in vain. And maybe, just maybe, home wasn't just a place. It was the people who still remembered. James sat there for a long moment, his fingers resting on the edge of the worn photograph. The diner's soft hum returned, but something had changed. Not just in the room, but in him. He had spent years carrying the weight of his service, the memories of brothers lost, and the sting of a country that didn't always welcome him. But here, in the warmth of this small diner, among strangers who had stepped forward in quiet solidarity, he felt something unfamiliar, belonging. The older veteran, now seated at the counter, sipped his coffee in silence. Every now and then, he glanced at James, as if making sure he was still there. The owner, wiping his hands on a towel, leaned against the register and cleared his throat. "Funny thing about diners," he mused. "You never know what kind of stories walk through that door." He looked James in the eye. "And you never know when it's your turn to stand up." James nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind the words. Then the door swung open again. This time it was a younger man, maybe in his late 20s, dressed in a mechanic's uniform, grease stains on his sleeves. He hesitated when he saw James, his expression uncertain. He had witnessed the earlier scene but had stayed silent, like many others. Now something in his face showed regret. He walked up to James' table, shifting awkwardly before speaking. I just wanted to say I should have said something earlier, he admitted. I saw what happened. I didn't like it, but I just sat there. He swallowed, then straightened his shoulders. That was wrong. James studied him for a moment. The young man looked sincere, like someone trying to undo a mistake. It takes a lot to admit that, James said. Thank you. The mechanic nodded, relieved, then hesitated. If you ever need your car looked at, I run the shop down the street, free of charge. James chuckled lightly. I appreciate that, but I don't have a car. The young man grinned. Well, whenever you do, you know where to find me. As he left, James exhaled deeply. Moments like this didn't erase the pain of the past, but they mattered. The waitress returned with a refill for his coffee, her expression soft. Were you headed after this? James stirred the steaming cup, watching the ripples spread. Not sure yet, he admitted. Haven't figured that part out. The older veteran at the counter turned slightly. Some of us meet every Wednesday down at the VFW, he said. Old war stories, bad coffee, and a chance to remember the ones who didn't come home. He held James' gaze. You oughta come by sometime. James tapped his fingers against the table, considering it. For so long, he had been moving, never stopping long enough to plant roots. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to change that. Outside, the sky had shifted to gold and amber as the sun dipped lower. James finished the last bite of his pie, savoring it. The world wasn't perfect, but it wasn't without hope. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just passing through. Maybe he was finally on his way home. James sat in silence for a moment, the offer lingering in his mind. The idea of sitting in a room full of veterans, sharing stories of war and loss, felt both comforting and unsettling. He had spent years avoiding such gatherings, not because he didn't care, but because remembering was sometimes harder than forgetting. But tonight felt different. He glanced around the diner, at the young girl who had offered him pie, at the mechanic who had found the courage to admit his silence, at the veteran who had reminded him that brotherhood didn't end on the battlefield. Maybe he didn't have to carry it all alone. James took a final sip of his coffee and set the cup down. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few worn dollar bills, placing them on the table. The owner saw and shook his head. It's taken care of, he reminded him. James hesitated before nodding in gratitude. As he stood, the veteran at the counter turned slightly, watching him. So, what do you say? The old soldier asked. See you Wednesday? James adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, feeling the weight of it less than before. He thought about all the places he had been, all the people he had lost. And he thought about all the people he had met today, strangers who had reminded him that not everyone turned away in silence. For the first time in years, he had a choice. Keep wandering or finally stop running. A slow smile crossed his face. Yeah, James said, his voice steady. I think I will. The veteran nodded in approval. James turned toward the door, stepping out into the cool evening air. The street was quiet, the sky painted in deep blues and purples. He took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside him. For so long, he had searched for home. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally found it.